hello. Is this on? Hello, hello, hello. Can you hear me? Can you hear me in the back? Yeah. Okay. So anyway, thanks for joining us. I'm very excited to do this interview. I'm going to be talking to Michèle Griffin. She has the greatest job title on earth. She's the director of the Summit of the Future, or the Future Summit. And she's also kind of runs policy planning at the UN and has been involved in UN reform efforts, like really in the weeds for many, many years, and has been sort of guiding this process for the last 5 years or so. And involved, deeply in sort of all of the initial drafts and putting, the Secretary General's visions into print. So, why don't we start right here and have a seat? So let's just start off with just a general sense. I mean, I've been focusing on and sort of covering this negotiation on all the, the difficulties, the tough fights that have been going on between the Russians and others. But, it's sometimes hard to lose sight with, all the issues you were looking at the beginning and sort of how it's come out at the end. So why don't you just sort of give us a sense of what you think, at the end of the day, after all these negotiations, what this document delivers? Should we be excited about it? Or, is it sort of lost opportunities, or, so anyway, it's all yours. Floor is yours.
Thanks, Colum. Oh, does this work? Can you hear me? Well, first of all, thank you for having me. Second of all, yeah, this for me was a 5-year process, which took approximately 20 years off my life. But I'm feeling very, very relieved and very proud of what we've achieved. And at a time of really pretty significant geopolitical division, we've reached a very comprehensive agreement on a lot of issues. And it includes some very new areas where there's never been universal agreement before, but it also includes some issues on which we have not agreed in many, many decades. So, in that latter category, I would put Security Council reform. It's the most concrete, progressive agreement on Security Council reform since the 1960s. We have the first universal agreed language on nuclear disarmament since 2010. And, a lot of other areas where I think we've really struggled to agree for a very long time. And then some of the newer areas where we have reached agreement in this pact. Obviously, digital cooperation, governance of AI, lots of the kind of new domains of human activity, whether it's cyberspace or outer space, putting in place much better understandings about how we govern human activity in those places, how human rights and international humanitarian law and international law more generally apply. How we manage the risks to people's safety from all of that new activity, but also how we harness the benefits for more people around the world than maybe it otherwise would be the case. So looking at the weaponization of emerging tech and AI, maritime security is another area, and then a huge amount in the Pact and the Digital Compact and the Declaration on Future Generations look at how do we really create the conditions in which we can achieve the SDGs, which we're obviously quite off track on. Right. And some of the biggest kind of agreements I think there to point out are all of the agreements on international financial architecture reform, looking at debt and financing, climate finance, and a whole load of other areas. So very proud, very satisfied, very relieved.
Right. I mean, it's one of the difficulties in covering this issue is that it's basically everything. I mean, you're covering everything from sexual rights to peaceful uses of outer space and the whole sort of gamut in between. But one of the things I'm interested about is that this sort of lays out kind of a roadmap on a lot of these sort of global issues, but they still need to be implemented, and implementation is going to require future political agreements. The Russians, had a sort of a noisy kind of conclusion to this debate. Said that it wasn't consensus, and then afterwards, their deputy foreign minister came out and said that, that Russia would not recognize this document being reflected in other UN documents. If you want to fund certain initiatives in it, you need to go through the Fifth Committee, which is the UN Budget Committee. And Russia pulls a lot of levers in the UN. So how do you go from this agreement to actually implementation?
Well, I mean, I think the first thing to bear in mind is that there were 192 countries that really did want to adopt this pact. And in particular, if you saw what happened in the General Assembly on Sunday at the summit, the Global South really wanted this pact. There's a lot in there for them because a lot of the underlying proposals and agreements now were about giving them a better voice in international governance and better for them to be better served by the international architecture. So I think that will of the vast majority of member states, but also of all of the other stakeholders who were part of this process has to, will carry on and will have to carry on. And no international agreement, obviously, gets implemented overnight by every single person who signs up to it. There's always foot dragging, but I think that the really important thing will be to keep the pressure up. The nice thing about the agreement is that we have a lot of baked in kind of language and agreement that immediately gets taken up in future conferences and events. So whether that's at COP29 or at the Financing for Development Conference or the World Social Summit or Unispace 4 in 2027. So, most of the issues there were drafted with a view to then providing momentum for the future moments on the calendar where they can be taken forward.
So let me ask you a question. I mean, one of the big, sort of obstacles to reaching an agreement on some sort of international, financial reform is that a lot of the donors, particularly the US, they want all these decisions to be made in the G7, G20, the World Bank, the IMF, right? And the G77 for years and others have been really trying to get more of the substantive discussions on this issue at the UN, where there are 193 members. It's a broader span of people, more democratic, but also plays to their advantage. I mean, what is it that, I mean, does this obviously sort of lets the UN talk about it more, but when it comes down to fundamental decision making, allocation of funds and that sort of thing, I mean, does it really make a difference?
I think it really does. And I mean, you're right that was a through thread through the whole negotiations was where do decisions get made? But what got lost sight of is that this was a summit at the head of state level. Heads of state are in charge of all of their ministries, not just their foreign ministries, and they are where the decisions ultimately come to rest. So this wasn't about one organization telling another organization what to do or how to do its job better. This was really about having heads of state come together, heads of government, and say, we need the whole international architecture to work more effectively. And in order to do that, we're going to agree on a direction of travel, on debt, on the representation of developing countries in the IFIs, on climate finance, on safety nets. On SDG financing, and some of those decisions will get implemented and pursued in Washington. Some will get implemented and pursued in New York. Most will have to be implemented and pursued at national level. So it was really a very kind of head of state level summit for that reason, and that's why we needed it to be a summit.
Right. So let's talk about Security Council enlargement and expansion, which was a key element. It was it's been basically this nagging issue that has really kind of poisoned a lot of the discussions about, the success of multilateralism. How could you have a Security Council that only reflects the balance of power from the Second World War? Doesn't include any permanent African members on the council. The five are, the only countries with veto. I mean, this discussion has been going on quite actively. I mean, I think in this context since 2005, but this was a discussion going back to the 1990s. And there have always been, aspirations to do this and a kind of recognition that that's the right thing to do. But, on the one hand, you have, no second tier regional power wants to have the first tier regional power in that position. So regionally, governments would try to undermine the process. And then, of course, the P5 didn't want to give up their privileges. And, the French, the British, the Americans, I think, have talked a good game. But, there's really questions. Do they really want to have to share that power? So why is this different? Why should one expect this to actually result in, an enlargement of the Security Council for the first time since the 1960s?
Well, because they've agreed to do it. Now, I know that the cynics in the room might say, well, that doesn't mean anything, but this is actually the first concrete agreement with a lot of detail in it to reform the council. Yes, there's more work ahead, but I think even the P5 recognized that the legitimacy and credibility of the council has really been affected by recent failures of the council to agree, to address and deal with conflict. We're seeing that every day. And so even they can't ignore this upswell of pressure for meaningful council reform. And the truth is, I think, again, the story of this summit is partly a story of an overall attempt to make the international architecture more reflective of how power and how need exist in today's world and not in the days of our grandparents. The Secretary General has said multiple times, we can't create a future fit for our grandchildren with the systems built by our grandparents. And the Council is one of the bodies that he most often points to. So I think we've come to the point where even the P5 can't ignore that, can't ignore the pressure. And again, implementing this and keeping these agreements, making these agreements be more than words on paper is going to require continued pressure from a lot of different sources.
Right. Okay. This would be a topic that could go on for a lot longer than the minute and a half that we have left. But let me ask you on the peace and security front, which is a big piece of this agreement. I mean, there's a sense that the UN is, that you don't see the UN at the center of political mediation in conflict areas. They don't really have a central role in Sudan. They don't have, you don't see the Secretary General, doing shuttle diplomacy over the Middle East. Ukraine, the UN Secretary General very much focused on humanitarian issues, but I get the sense that there's this, craving for the UN to play more of a role in peacemaking in addition to these other issues. And is there anything in terms of the reform in this document that sort of signals a kind of a road ahead on that front?
I mean, having spent most of my career working on those issues, I think that yes and no. There are some very clear, strong signals in the pact that the SG should kind of offer and use his good offices more. That there should be more regional confidence building. There's lots of very strong language on protection of civilians, on use of explosive weapons, on the ICJ, on maritime security. So if you look for it, there's a lot of language in the pact that tries to speak to current conflicts and the shortcomings in our responses to those conflicts. That said, I mean, I think as anyone who works in this field knows, we can't force ourselves into situations where the conditions aren't there and the parties don't want to talk and the big powers or regional powers involved in the conflict don't want us. We're not an army, and so I think that's just the fundamental reality of the UN. And we can't, as the UN, do what our member states don't want us to do. So in the end of the day, there's lots of great language in there in the pact, but if people have the political will to kind of turn that into reality, great. And if they don't, there's not an enormous amount that we can necessarily do about that.
Right. Well, I could go on, but we're out of time. So I just want to thank Michèle for joining us, and congratulations to her. This was a long slog, and it wasn't at all a given that it would result in an actual pact. So well done. Congratulations. Take care. Thanks.
Thank you.